Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is lighting something on fire and inhaling the smoke on purpose. That sounds insane when you say it plainly like that. Breathing smoke deliberately for pleasure, and yet archaeological evidence suggests your species has been doing exactly this for roughly 12,000 years across nearly every continent, independently invented by cultures that had no contact with each other whatsoever. That's not a coincidence you can explain away easily. By the end of this video, you'll understand what was actually driving this behavior long before anyone had ever heard of nicotine, tobacco companies, or addiction science, and why the urge to burn plants and inhale the result runs so much deeper than most people realize. Let's start with the evidence itself. Researchers studying ancient pipes and residue have found burnt plant material and inhalation tools dating back thousands of years on multiple continents, long before written history, long before anyone understood chemistry or biology in any modern sense. In the Americas, archaeological sites have uncovered tobacco residue in pipes dating back several thousand years, with some genetic evidence suggesting tobacco was being cultivated and used even earlier than that. Entirely separate cultures in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific developed their own independent traditions of smoking various plants, from cannabis to wild herbs to other regional botanicals, often for ritual, medicinal, or social purposes. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. This wasn't one culture's strange habit spreading slowly around the globe through trade routes and contact. Multiple, unconnected human societies appear to have arrived at strikingly similar behavior, burning specific plants and inhaling the smoke independently, using completely different plant species available in their own regions. When something shows up independently that many times across that much of human history, anthropologists start asking a different question. Not why did this culture do this strange thing, but what is it about human biology and human societies that makes this particular behavior so likely to emerge again and again wherever humans exist? Let's look at some of these independent traditions more closely, because the details matter. In what is now the southwestern United States and Mexico, archaeologists have recovered pipes and residue linked to wild tobacco species going back thousands of years, often found alongside ceremonial objects rather than ordinary household items, suggesting the earliest use was tightly bound up with ritual significance from the very beginning. Independently, on the other side of the world, evidence from parts of Africa points to ancient traditions of smoking cannabis and various regional plants for both medicinal and ceremonial purposes, again showing up in contexts connected to healing practices and communal gatherings rather than casual daily habit. In parts of Asia, distinct plant traditions emerged around herbs used in traditional medicine systems, sometimes smoked, sometimes burned as incense and inhaled passively, blurring the line between medicine, ritual, and altered states of consciousness. None of these traditions borrowed from each other. They emerged on separate continents, using entirely different plants, arriving at a strikingly similar core behavior. Burn a plant, inhale what rises from it, and build meaning and ritual around the resulting experience. The earliest documented uses weren't about pleasure the way modern smoking is often framed. Ethnobotanists studying indigenous traditions across the Americas have found that many early tobacco and plant smoking practices were deeply tied to ritual and spiritual purposes, inducing altered states of consciousness for shamanic practices, marking significant ceremonies, sealing agreements between groups, or connecting communities to what were understood as spiritual or ancestral realms. Smoke itself carried symbolic weight, independent of whatever chemical effects the burning plant produced. It rose upward, visibly dramatically, disappearing into open air in a way that made it an almost universally intuitive symbol for connecting the physical world to something beyond it. Think about why smoke specifically might carry that kind of symbolic power across such different cultures. Unlike almost anything else early humans could produce, rising smoke visibly bridges the ground where people stand and the open sky, where weather, sun, stars, and unknown forces existed beyond anyone's control or understanding. A fire could be built anywhere. A pipe could be carved from local materials nearly anywhere. But the visual experience of watching smoke curl upward and vanish into open air was universally available to every human culture on Earth, regardless of climate, geography, or available plant species. That may be part of why so many unconnected cultures independently arrived at smoke as something symbolically significant, even before considering whatever plant happened to be burning. This helps explain part of the mystery, but it doesn't explain all of it. Symbolic meaning alone doesn't account for why this specific method, burning and inhaling, became so widespread compared to countless other possible rituals involving fire or plants. For that, you need to look at the chemistry itself. Many of the plants humans have smoked throughout history, tobacco included, contain compounds that interact directly and powerfully with the human nervous system. Nicotine specifically binds to receptors in the brain that are part of your body's normal signaling system for attention, mood regulation, and reward. When inhaled through smoke, rather than ingested another way, these compounds reach the brain remarkably quickly, sometimes within seconds. Because your lungs offer an extraordinarily direct, efficient pathway into the bloodstream, this isn't a modern discovery. It's simply how human physiology has always worked, and ancient people, without understanding the underlying chemistry at all, would have quickly noticed that inhaling certain burning plants produced fast, reliable, and repeatable effects on mood, alertness, or perception. It's worth pausing on just how fast this pathway actually is, because the speed itself is part of the explanation. Substances absorbed through the digestive system have to survive stomach acid, pass through the liver, and gradually enter the bloodstream over the course of many minutes. Substances inhaled through the lungs bypass almost all of that. The lungs contain an enormous surface area of extremely thin tissue, specifically built for rapid gas exchange, originally evolved for pulling oxygen into the blood as efficiently as possible. Smoke inhalation essentially hijacks that same efficient biological pathway, delivering active plant compounds to the brain within seconds rather than minutes. Ancient people had no name for pharmacokinetics, no understanding of absorption rates or blood-brain barriers, but they absolutely could feel the difference between chewing a plant and inhaling its smoke, and that felt difference alone was enough to shape which method cultures gravitated toward again and again. Once a plant reliably produced a noticeable mental or emotional shift, and did so quickly and consistently, cultural practices tended to form around it, whether that meant medicinal use, ceremonial use, or eventually social and recreational use as well. Historical records support just how quickly this cultural adoption could happen once a useful plant was identified. When tobacco was introduced to European populations in the 16th century, following contact with the Americas, its spread across the continent happened remarkably fast, reaching most of Europe, parts of Africa, and Asia within roughly a century, an astonishingly quick adoption rate for the era, especially considering how slowly information and goods otherwise traveled at the time. That speed of adoption is itself a clue. It suggests the underlying appeal wasn't something that needed to be taught or culturally constructed from nothing. It was something human brains, largely regardless of culture or background, responded to almost immediately once exposed to it. It's worth sitting with how remarkable that spread actually was. Within roughly 100 years of European contact with the Americas, tobacco use had been adopted by populations across 3 separate continents, cultures with wildly different languages, religions, social structures, and belief systems, none of whom shared any prior history with the plant at all. Very few technologies or cultural practices in human history have spread that fast, that broadly across that many unrelated societies. Wheels took millennia to reach some regions. Written language took centuries to spread even along established trade routes. Tobacco crossed the known world in roughly one lifetime. That speed strongly suggests the appeal wasn't cultural conditioning built slowly over generations. It was something closer to an immediate biological response that different human populations, everywhere it was tried, responded to in strikingly similar ways almost on first exposure. There's also a compelling evolutionary angle that some researchers have proposed, sometimes called the drug-reward hypothesis. Under this idea, the human brain's reward system, the same neural circuitry that evolved to reinforce genuinely survival-relevant behaviors like eating nutrient-rich food or forming social bonds, doesn't perfectly distinguish between a naturally rewarding behavior and a plant compound that happens to stimulate that exact same reward pathway artificially. Certain plants, through what's sometimes described as an evolutionary coincidence, produce chemicals that closely mimic or strongly activate the brain's existing reward machinery. Your ancient ancestors weren't seeking out nicotine specifically, since they had no concept of it. They were noticing that a particular burning plant made them feel a specific, repeatable way. And that repeatable feeling was often experienced as rewarding, alerting, calming, or otherwise significant enough to build lasting cultural practices around. This raises an interesting evolutionary question of its own. Why would plants produce compounds that so precisely interact with animal reward systems in the first place? One leading explanation from botanists is that many of these compounds evolved primarily as natural pesticides, chemical defenses meant to deter insects and herbivores from eating the plant, by disrupting their nervous systems in ways that made the plant taste unpleasant or physically harmful to smaller creatures. Nicotine, under this view, evolved in tobacco plants as a defense mechanism, not as a gift to human brains. It's simply an accident of shared neurological architecture across species that a chemical built to disable an insect's nervous system happens to interact in much smaller relative doses with specific reward and attention pathways in the far larger and more complex human brain. Your ancestors weren't discovering something plants made for them. They were discovering an unintended side effect of a plant's defense system, one that happened to feel significant enough to build entire cultural practices around. This pattern isn't unique to tobacco either. Botanists studying cannabis have found a similar evolutionary story. The compounds cannabis produces, including THC, appear to have evolved primarily to protect the plant from ultraviolet radiation damage and to deter insects and grazing animals, functions with no connection whatsoever to human psychology. And yet, archaeological evidence from Central Asia, including burnt cannabis residue found in ancient burial sites, suggests humans in that region were deliberately inhaling cannabis smoke for its psychoactive effects at least 2,500 years ago, entirely independently from anything happening with tobacco use across the ocean in the Americas at roughly the same broad era. Two continents, two completely unrelated plants, two entirely separate chemical compounds, and yet two human populations arrived at the same fundamental behavior: burn the plant, inhale the result, and build ritual and meaning around what happens next. Look at cannabis specifically for a moment because its independent history mirrors tobacco's in a way that strengthens the overall pattern. Ancient texts and archaeological findings from regions including modern-day China, India, and parts of the Middle East describe cannabis use dating back thousands of years, sometimes for medicinal purposes, sometimes tied to religious and spiritual ceremonies, and sometimes, in some documented cases, burned in enclosed spaces specifically so multiple people could inhale the resulting smoke together in a shared ritual setting. A striking parallel to the communal tobacco pipe traditions found independently across the Americas. Herodotus, writing in ancient Greece over 2,000 years ago, described a Scythian ritual involving cannabis seeds thrown onto heated stones inside an enclosed tent, producing vapor that participants would inhale together as part of a communal ceremonial practice. This wasn't tobacco, it wasn't the Americas. It was an entirely separate plant, an entirely separate continent, and an entirely separate cultural tradition, arriving independently at the same essential structure: shared enclosed space, heated or burned plant material, and collective inhalation as meaningful ritual. This also helps explain why smoking specifically, rather than simply eating these plants, became so widespread across independent cultures. Combustion breaks down plant material in ways that release these active compounds into a vapor that can be inhaled directly into the lungs, producing effects far faster and more intensely than digestion through the stomach ever could. Ancient people almost certainly didn't understand pharmacokinetics, but they didn't need to. They simply noticed, through direct repeated experience, that smoke worked differently and worked faster than other methods of using the same plant. There's a social dimension too, one that shows up again and again in the historical and anthropological record. Shared pipes, communal smoking ceremonies, ritual smoke used to seal treaties and agreements between groups. All of this points to smoking serving a coordinating social function well beyond whatever individual chemical effects it produced. Anthropologists studying these practices note that shared consumption of any substance, food, drink, or smoke, tends to build group cohesion and trust, and smoking may have functioned partly as an early, deeply embodied form of social bonding technology long before anyone had a word for social bonding at all. The specific ritual of passing a single pipe between multiple people, rather than each person smoking their own, appears repeatedly across unrelated cultures, and that repetition is worth sitting with. A shared pipe requires physical closeness, turn-taking, and a degree of trust, since each participant is quite literally putting their mouth where another person's mouth has just been. Anthropologists studying group bonding behaviors have found that rituals requiring this kind of physical vulnerability and synchronized turn-taking tend to produce measurably stronger feelings of group cohesion than solitary versions of the same activity. Whether ancient cultures understood this consciously or not, the structure of the ritual itself, shared, sequential, physically intimate, may have reinforced social bonds independently of whatever the smoke itself chemically did to each individual participant. There's another piece of this puzzle worth exploring. What happens to the body and brain once this behavior becomes regular rather than occasional? Modern neuroscience has identified a process called tolerance, in which repeated exposure to a substance like nicotine causes the brain to gradually adjust its own baseline chemistry, producing fewer natural reward signals on its own and effectively depending more on the external substance to reach reach a normal, previously effortless emotional baseline. This is part of why occasional ceremonial use, spaced out across weeks or tied to specific rare occasions, behaves very differently in the brain than daily, repeated use. Ancient ritual structures, whether intentionally or not, often built in exactly this kind of spacing, whether through religious calendars, seasonal ceremonies, or limited availability, which may have prevented many ancient users from ever reaching the kind of chronic tolerance and dependence that becomes common under modern, unrestricted daily access. The chemistry driving the initial appeal was always the same. What differed dramatically across history was how often and under what constraints people were exposed to it. This tolerance mechanism also sheds light on why quitting modern smoking is notoriously difficult in a way that likely didn't apply the same way to most ancient ceremonial users. Once the brain has adjusted its baseline chemistry around regular nicotine exposure, removing that exposure doesn't simply return the brain to its original state immediately. There's a withdrawal period during which the brain's own reward and mood regulation systems are operating below their adjusted baseline, producing genuine physical and psychological discomfort until the system gradually recalibrates. Researchers studying addiction have found this recalibration period can last anywhere from days to several weeks depending on the substance and duration of use, and understanding this as a genuine neurological adjustment process, rather than simply a failure of willpower, has significantly shaped how modern medicine approaches treatment for nicotine dependence today. There's yet another independent thread worth including here, from a part of the world often overlooked in discussions of smoking history. In parts of Australia and the Pacific Islands, indigenous populations developed their own distinct traditions involving native plants chewed or smoked for both stimulant and ceremonial effects, entirely separate from tobacco traditions in the Americas or cannabis traditions in Asia. Some Aboriginal Australian communities have long documented traditions of chewing certain native plants containing nicotine-like alkaloids, occasionally combined with ash to enhance the release of active compounds, a sophisticated chemical technique arrived at through generations of careful observation without any contact whatsoever with tobacco-using cultures on the other side of the planet. The specific plant was different. The exact method, chewing combined with alkaline ash rather than direct combustion, was different too. But the underlying goal, extracting a psychoactive plant compound as efficiently as possible for a reliable mental or physical effect, was once again strikingly familiar. Taken together, this means we now have independently documented traditions spanning the Americas, Africa, Europe, following contact, large parts of Asia, the Middle East, and Australia and the Pacific, each arriving at some version of intentionally extracting and consuming a psychoactive plant compound, frequently through burning or heating, frequently tied to ritual and community bonding, and frequently involving compounds that happen to interact strongly with the same evolved reward circuitry sitting inside every human brain, regardless of geography. That is an extraordinarily wide, extraordinarily consistent pattern for something to be pure coincidence. There's a psychological angle worth exploring too, beyond the pure chemistry and evolutionary biology. The role ritual timing itself seems to have played in shaping these behaviors sustainably across generations. Anthropologists studying long-standing ceremonial plant traditions have noted that many of the oldest smoking rituals weren't just occasional by circumstance. They were occasional by design, deliberately restricted to specific religious calendars, coming-of-age ceremonies, seasonal festivals, or diplomatic occasions. This wasn't simply because the plants were scarce, though scarcity certainly played a role in some regions. Many cultures actively built rules and taboos around when smoking was appropriate, effectively creating built-in structural limits on frequency that most modern smokers no longer have any equivalent of. Some anthropologists argue this ritual structure may have served an unintentional but genuinely protective function, allowing communities to access the meaningful bonding and even medicinal aspects of these plants while structurally preventing the kind of constant, unrestricted daily exposure that drives modern tolerance and dependence. It's worth noting that modern researchers are careful to separate this ancient, often ritualized history from the very different scale and health consequences of modern commercial cigarette smoking. The compounds that made these plants so behaviorally significant to ancient cultures are the same compounds modern science has identified as highly addictive, and the mass production, chemical additives, and daily habitual use associated with modern cigarettes represent something quite different in both scale and health impact from an occasional ceremonial pipe passed among a small small group. Understanding the ancient roots of this behavior isn't an endorsement of modern smoking. It's an explanation for why the underlying urge exists in the first place, deeply enough that industries built on it were able to scale a once occasional ritual into a daily global habit. This distinction between ancient ritual use and modern industrial use matters more than it might first appear. Historians studying the transition point out that for most of the 12,000 years this behavior existed, access to tobacco and similar plants was naturally limited by how much could be grown, harvested and processed by hand, and use was often further limited by cultural and ceremonial rules governing when and how it could be consumed. The invention of mechanized cigarette rolling in the late 19th century, combined with mass advertising in the 20th century, removed nearly every one of those natural limits at once. An activity that had existed for millennia as an occasional, often ritually bounded practice was transformed within a few decades into something available constantly, cheaply, and without any of the cultural structure that had previously shaped when and how often it occurred. The underlying human response to nicotine didn't change. What changed was the removal of every natural constraint that had shaped that response for most of human history. This has real implications for how modern science approaches helping people quit. Understanding that ancient use was moderated primarily by structural, cultural, and availability limits, rather than by some inherent human ability to resist the underlying chemical pull, has shifted modern treatment approaches away from viewing dependence purely as a matter of individual willpower. Contemporary cessation programs increasingly focus on rebuilding some of those structural limits artificially through gradual nicotine tapering, environmental changes that reduce exposure to smoking triggers, and replacing the social and ritual functions smoking once served with alternative, healthier forms of connection and stress relief. In effect, modern medicine is often trying to recreate, deliberately and clinically, some version of the natural restraint that ancient ritual calendars and scarcity once provided automatically, without anyone ever needing to consciously design it that way in the first place. So when you put all of these threads together, independent invention across multiple unconnected continents, a direct and fast-acting effect on brain chemistry through inhalation, cultural and ritual significance tied to fire and rising smoke, an evolutionary accident of plant chemistry crossing paths with animal reward systems, a genuine social bonding function reinforced by the specific structure of shared ritual, and deliberate cultural structures that once kept the behavior occasional rather than constant. You start to see why this particular behavior emerged again and again throughout human history, rather than simply appearing once and slowly spreading. It wasn't one culture's peculiar habit. It was multiple independent groups of humans on nearly every inhabited continent discovering through trial and observation that a specific combination of fire, plant chemistry, and human neurobiology produced something reliably powerful enough to build entire rituals, economies, and social structures around. It's a genuinely rare thing in human history to find a behavior this consistent across cultures with absolutely no contact with one another. Most shared human customs, styles of clothing, architectural techniques, even certain foods tend to spread through trade, migration, or conquest, leaving behind clear archaeological or linguistic evidence of that contact. Smoking's history offers something different. A behavior invented from scratch, over and over, by people who never met, never traded, and never knew the others existed, all converging on the same essential act, because the same essential biology was waiting inside every one of them. So the next time you see someone light a cigarette, or picture a ceremonial pipe passed around a fire thousands of years ago, you're looking at something far older and far stranger than a modern habit or a marketing-driven addiction. You're looking at one of the oldest, most independently reinvented behaviors your species has ever produced, rooted in a genuine collision between plant chemistry and human neurobiology that different groups of humans, worlds apart and with no contact at all, somehow managed to discover again and again and again.